The first one is with Giacomo from EPFL. His field of research is experimental museology. The title of his presentation is Exploring Large Audiovisual Archive Through Embodied Experiences in Immersive Environments. And the second one is from Adrian from the DH Lab of the University of Basel. His field of research are sustainable software and archival practices. The title of his presentation is From Methods to Practice. And a little fun fact, both of them has some interest in octopuses, as you may mentioned on their arms. So I wish you all two exciting presentations. I hand over to Giacomo.
Okay, so thank you. I hope this is working. So octopus number one here. So as Thomas has said, this presentation is about how to explore large audiovisual archives. And to start it off, so those are the main steps I want to cover today. And let's go right to in. To start, I would like just to have a quick example with The Zen and Heart of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig. Very nice book that I hope at least someone has read, and otherwise I can only highly recommend it. And at the beginning of his book, he gives a very interesting example of what's the difference felt by travelers when they're in a car compared to on a motorcycle. In the first case, they are well encapsulated inside the car. They're not really leaving that environment. They're only seeing through the car windows. While for a motorcyclist, it is a much more embodied experience because they're feeling the wind of their faces. If it's raining, they're gonna get wet. It's a very different way to feel that environment. And so there's the idea of embodiment that I want to apply in immersive environments to explore large audiovisual archives. So in a similar way, my research aims at proposing an innovative framework to explore large audiovisual archives, employing immersive environments to reach an idea of immersive generosity and embodied understanding, the two concepts that I'm trying to explain with this presentation. So first of all, I would like to justify why we actually need such a new framework. And first, this need has been highlighted both by the digital humanities and scholars and the GLAM sectors. The Cinematheque yesterday told us a bit about this. For instance, we can see that in 2014, already 80% of EU cultural institutions had digitized their collections according to a survey. And I'm pretty sure today it's even more than that. And there's also a big increase in the digitization of audiovisual archives. You can think, for instance, of the BBC that has more than 1 million hours, or closer to Rome, Rai-Teke, the digital archive of the RAI, the main Italian broadcasting institution, that has more than 1.3 million hours of footage. And at the same time, archival scholars have called for innovative frameworks to explore those archives that go beyond the classical screening sessions. When I think of it, when a curator has chosen a set of films, of movies to show, the main issue is that this cannot really work when you are dealing with hundreds of thousands of videos. No one has the time to actually watch that amount of films. So that we need some other ways to explore the entire collection. And one might say that the classical information retrieval is able to more or less solve this issue. But it also has some strict and serious limitations on my mind, especially when you apply it to a museum setting. First of all, it's often based on classifications and metadata that have been tagged by someone, meaning that there are some embedded prior assumptions. And it also often responds to different needs. A catalog is not, at first at least, it's not necessarily meant for visualization, for instance. And also visual features of videos, due to their temporal nature as well, they're harder to verbally capture. It's very difficult to capture movement in a video. How would you define the person that is actually moving with some tags, with some categories? And furthermore, information retrieval presupposes actually that you have a query. It seems obvious, but to start an information retrieval, you need a question. And in museums, visitors do not necessarily have those questions. I don't know about you, but when I go to a museum, I don't necessarily know what I'm looking for in a specific way. So it's been very hard for me to actually get something relevant with an information retrieval in a museum setting. So the idea is that we can go towards immersive generosity. And this term more or less created from using the idea of generous interfaces put forward by Whitelaw in 2015. Whitelaw argues that Searching requires rich, browsable interfaces that reveal the scale and complexity of digital heritage collections. So the emphasis is on browsing the full collection, or at least a large portion of it. And this would rely on a more humanistic approach of browsing, rather than the traditional visualization mantra proposed by Schneiderman in the early 2000s. That is, according to humanistic scholar Drucker, highly mechanistic. This Schneiderman mantra presupposes a goal, and again, users in a museum might not necessarily have such a clear goal in mind, and therefore a more humanistic approach of just browsing in the entire, exploring the entire collection might be more interesting to them. I'm missing. Okay. So as an example of such a generous interface, we can think, for instance, of the Sensory Moving Image Archive developed in 2019 at the University of Amsterdam. In this, a very interesting example that I invite you to look at on the website, there's a link on the slide. It's a web interface to explore more than 100,000 shots from videos that are spatially distributed according to 4 visual features: color, shape, movement, and clutter. So as I said before, features that are very hard to capture verbally with tags, for instance. And as you can see on the top right, those shots are distributed in 2D. And you can see, for instance, it seems mostly by color, at least towards the center of the image. And once you click on one of those shots, you can see perhaps in the bottom left of the second image that there are 5 other propositions. In a sense, those are the classical nearest neighbors that perhaps you have already heard of. And the idea is also that it creates a proposition of serendipitous discoveries of new items with also connections that you might actually not have thought of. It's the connections that machines, that the algorithms have found, but humans perhaps would not necessarily think of them. Think, for instance, of the green, or in this case of the leaves. It might be linked to the green of grass in a football field, and then the football field could be linked to the movement of another sport through the movement of the players. So this creates this path that is not perhaps obvious to humans, but is created by machines. The issue with generous interfaces is that they are mostly restrained to the web. And of course, that's very good for the democratization of culture, and especially with COVID, we've seen how important it is to have access on the web. But at the same time, they lack immersion and engagement in museum spaces. When you go to a museum, you don't really want to sit at the desk and have a keyboard and mouse to interact with a classical web interface. So my proposition is to port those generous interfaces to immersive environments to augment the public engagement with audiovisual archives in museum spaces, and to rely on the idea of embodied understanding put forward by philosopher Johnson, that I will try to explain to you. And of course, this will also have an effect on how narrative emerges. And this will be the last part of this presentation. So the concept of embodied understanding has been put forward by philosopher Mark Johnson, according to whom understanding is profoundly embodied insofar as our conceptualization and reasoning recruit sensory, motor, and affective patterns and processes to structure our understanding of and engagement with our world. Basically, what Johnson is saying is that the way we understand our world depends on our bodies. It's directly linked to our bodies. And this goes against centuries of more disembodied views, where philosophers thought that it was mainly the mind that alone did all the work. But in the 20th century, with cognitive scientists and neuroscientists, they actually shown the importance of the body, and also the role of emotions, for instance, in our survival and well-being, something that we can also, of course, find in storytelling practices. And to explicit this idea of embodied understanding, Johnson puts forward 5 bodily sources of meaning, 5 dimensions, basically, to fully appreciate our embodied understanding. And I try next to discuss these 5 dimensions in relation to some examples of media installations. So the first one, at the first level, we can say we have the biological body. Our bodies are first and foremost flesh and blood, functional biological organisms that can perceive, move within, respond to, and transform their environments. they're in a continuous balance with their environment and to find an optimal well-being. To explicate this first dimension, we can think, for instance, of the media installation Osmose in 1995 by media artist Jared Davis. In her installation, users would, as you can see on the right image, would wear automated displays as well as vests that would track both their balance and their breathing. And the virtual world that you can see on the left would be created by their interactions, by the way they are moving, the way they are breathing. So two very fundamental actions, unconscious actions of humans. We are already always breathing and balancing ourselves in a certain way. The next dimension is the phenomenological one. Johnson talks about our tactile kinesthetic body that depends on our feeling of bodily posture, our gestures, the way we act. And especially for Italians, we know how important gestures are. And also about our kinesthetic sensations and our awareness of our body states through emotions and feelings. So those are much more conscious activities. And we also have the physical interactions that can be mapped to abstract operations on the data, the so-called tangentialities. For instance, we are a very recent project led by Dario Rodriguez at the Harvard Meta Lab, called Surprise Machines, in which the entire Harvard collection has been, again, spatially distributed according to visual features of the items. And they have created, they've mapped some gestures, as you can see in the image, to certain interactions, so that the body becomes a choreographic interface. The full body is used to explore this collection. So there is a very kinesthetic action of browsing the collection. The third dimension is the ecological one, the ecological body. And it comprehends all the continuous processes between our bodies and the environment we evolve within. So especially, for instance, if we look at the Living Web in 2002 by Krista Sommerer and Laurent Mignonneau, users are talking, and what they're saying basically is picked upon by the system that is basically listening to the users and crawling the web to find media elements that correspond to what people are saying. So even though they might not be aware of it, actually there is a dialogue created between the user and the system. You can also see that users are more or less completely immersed in that environment. In this case, it's a cave system, immersive environment. And so through the omnidirectional nature of large immersive environments that completely encapsulate the user or even multiple users at the same time, this allows for both allocentric and egocentric cognition and spatial perspective simultaneously. Very fancy terms to just say that basically users are able to both place objects with respect to each other's, but also with respect to themselves, because they are inside the environment. They're not looking at the environment on a flat screen, for instance. And so the idea of presence and immersion are stronger in such settings. As I said, this can also be for multiple users at the same time, or one user interacting, or multiple visitors seeing what happens. And this of course deals with the social body. Our environment is indeed also composed of human relationships. And so in an installation where a user is interacting and doing some performance, basically, the rest of the audience becomes a kind of public that is witnessing that performance. So we have the authorial role of the user agent in an interactive experience, creating a performance for the other visitors. We can mention, for instance, the work of Gert Moll, media artist, that talks about the third person's perspective. For him, basically, the user is a variable, the user agent is a variable in the generative process, and it's only the rest of the audience that is actually watching the entire performance, the full performance. In one of these pieces, for instance, Library of Babel in 2003, a collection of, I think, 100,000 images and a visual similarity software are used with a projection floor that projects patterns of images only when people are actually standing on that floor, even multiple people at the same time. But the thing is that you have to understand that if there's no one on the projection floor, nothing is happening. You could say there is actually no installation. The performance is driven by the users and is depending on people actually interacting with it, even multiple people at the same time. So of course, there are social interactions that arise in such settings. And the fifth and final dimension is the cultural body. For Johnson, there is a strong role of cultural practices in the way we shape and understand our bodies. I think there's nothing new in that, different cultures have different ways to move their bodies, to place their bodies, the different gestures we have, for instance. And so when we interpret a work, but also the performance, the actions of other users in the space, our cultures enter in that paradigm and have an effect on this interpretive action, both for the user agent and for the rest of us. In this case, for instance, we have Anti-Life by Sarah Kenderdine, in which there are basically digital avatars of Hindu deities that react to users' presence. And of course, you can imagine that if you know about Hinduism and Hindu deities, especially for people that lived in India, it's not going to be the same experience of people like us that I can imagine are not that familiar with Hinduism in general. It's going to be a different experience. So the idea is that these 5 dimensions can contribute to the idea of embodiment in immersive environments to augment the engagement with cultural collections. But of course, this has an effect on the emergence of narrative that I try to briefly cover. Elliott and Lushar proposed 4 dimensions to characterize it: contingency, presence, interactivity, and narrative representation. And we can argue that immersive visual storytelling has strong contingency in time and space, strong presence, and in the case of interactive performances, of course, interactivity. So the narrative representation places the viewers inside the collection and give them an authorial power of use in such settings. In immersive and interactive multi-user system, the user agent drives the narrative for the rest of the audience. Is no longer just a visitor or viewer, it's not a passive viewer, but it's actually an active user that is engaged. And is supported also by constructionist theories, increase the engagement with cultural collections because people are then actively crafting new knowledge, actually crafting meaning rather than passively watching it. So, as a conclusion, what I argue is that audiovisual archives need immersive generous interfaces to be explored in a meaningful way, letting users drive their own experience. This paradigm will result in a more embodied understanding and the emergence of narrative. It will reinvent our access to this kind of collections through a creative performance witnessed by other visitors in the space, placing users as actors in the experience rather than mere spectators. I just wanted to mention that this research is part of the project Narrative from the Long Tail, Transforming Access to Audiovisual Archives, funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation and led by Professor Sarah Kenderdine, that is also my supervisor. So thank you for your attention.